How do you know? Good question. When talking to people about whether or not God exists, you may have discovered that people are open to discussing God's existence as long as you don't use the Bible. Last time we discussed Ghazali's Kalam cosmological argument to show how through asking why the universe began to exist, we can see that it's reasonable to believe in God. This week we'll be looking at another argument, the teleological argument, or the argument from design. Now, science has a lot to say about the universe, but don't let this freak you out because you have a very basic understanding of various fields of science. Most of us barely remember science from high school, and just because you're not a scientist vocationally, it doesn't mean that you can't understand what is being explained by people in the various fields of science. And remember, science doesn't prove anything. Scientists interpret the outcome's meaning of their experiments. And side note, science is amazing! It is a fascinating subject, and historically, science owes a huge debt to many Christians, but that's another video for another day. Now, fine-tuning does not mean designed. Fine-tuning is understood to mean the range of life-permitting values for the constants and quantities is extremely low. In layman's terms, in order for life to exist in the universe, the conditions have to be just perfect. And when we say fine-tuning, we need to recognize that there are two kinds of fine-tuning. The first is nature's constants. When the laws of nature are expressed mathematically, there are certain symbols that represent unchanging quantities found in nature, like the force of gravity or the speed of light. Nature does not determine what these constants are, but these constants are found to be, well, pretty consistent, regardless of where you are in the universe. The second kind of fine-tuning is called arbitrary quantities. These are the not constants in nature and can change depending on where you are in the universe. Speaking of which, when looking at the universe, it is amazing to discover that life is only possible within an infinitesimally narrow margin of conditions. For instance, if the constant of the gravitational force were off by just one of its novemdecillion parts,
novemdecillion,
that's 10 with 60 zeros after it, the universe would have expanded too quickly so that no stars would have formed and life couldn't exist, or it wouldn't have expanded fast enough and it would have collapsed back upon itself. Either way, we wouldn't exist. In fact, all we know so far about the universe is that life seems limited to Earth and Earth alone. Now that could change, but even the life we might discover would still fall under an unimaginably narrow margin of just the right conditions to exist. The earliest documentation of the teleological argument goes way back to Socrates and Plato in ancient Greece. It was used by Thomas Aquinas in his 5 ways of proving God's existence. Today, it is still used by apologists such as University of Oxford Professor of Mathematics John Lennox and Research Professor of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology William Lane Craig. Here's the teleological argument. It has 2 premises and 1 conclusion. Premise 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Premise 2. It is not due to physical necessity or chance. Conclusion. Therefore, it is due to design. And that's it. Well, sort of. Like the other arguments, many non-believers dislike the implication of the conclusion. If there is a design, there is a designer. Let's look at premise 1. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Actually, no one disagrees with premise 1. Literally, no one. You can't object to premise 1 because all it does is provide 3 possibilities of why the universe is fine-tuned for life. That's not to say someone might not come up with a 4th alternative, but by all means, add it to the list and it will be considered just like the others in premise 2. Speaking of which, premise 2. It is not due to physical necessity or chance. Hold your horses. We're not just throwing these 2 out because we're Christians. No, that would be like the atheists throwing out design because they don't believe in a God of some sort. Let's look at both necessity and chance. We'll start with necessity. When it is argued that the universe is fine-tuned for life due to necessity, what's really being said is that the universe has to be life-permitting, that the universe must be life-permitting. In other words, it is necessary for the universe to be life-permitting. And why does the universe have to be life-permitting? Well, it's argued because the universe is life-permitting. It has to be this way because that's how it is. If that sounds ridiculous to you, That's because it is. This is the fallacy of petitio principii. This fallacy is committed when someone assumes what needs to be proven. By saying that the universe must be life-permitting because it is life-permitting, it doesn't actually prove why the universe is life-permitting. The person who says something must be because that's how it is still has to prove why the something is. And just because that's how something is, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how it must be. Reasonably, it could be something else. Just because that's how something is, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how it must be. Reasonably, it could be something else. Yes. Sometimes you will hear a scientist bring up the yet-to-be-discovered theory of everything.
So
No,
did you say something?
not that theory, although my wife does love this movie. That theory. No, if you don't understand what you're looking at, don't worry. Each of these symbols represents quite the background of information. Basically, the theory of everything is the idea that there is an equation that resolves problems with quantum mechanics, general relativity, and explains where the particles and forces that we know about came from. The idea is that one day we will discover this and it will explain, well, everything. This is where we meet a version of the fallacy ad ignorantium. This fallacy is committed when a person argues for a proposition by pointing to the absence of evidence that would contradict their proposition. In other words, when someone says just because we haven't discovered the theory of everything yet, it doesn't mean that there isn't a theory of everything. Now, this is just as bad as the Christians saying, well, since we don't know how it happened, I guess we'll just have to say it was God. I hate that. In the end, there's no evidence to suggest that a life-permitting universe is necessary. Well then, what about chance? When it is argued that the universe is fine-tuned for life due to chance, what's really being said is that the universe accidentally became life-permitting, and we just got really lucky. Imagine, if you will, a vault filled with billions and billions and billions of coins. Now, take one of those coins and put an X on it. Then toss that coin into the vault. Stir that vault a few thousand times so that the coins are mixed really well. Now dive into the vault, and from those billions and billions and billions of coins, only grab the one with an X on it. Now throw that coin back in and repeat this feat 4 more times, only grabbing one coin with an X on it. This is an accurate illustration of just how lucky life would have to be if chance were the reason the universe is life-permitting. And from this illustration, we can clearly see just how improbable retrieving the marked coin 5 times in a row would be. It's more likely that you would grab an unmarked coin instead. Someone will probably bring up the idea that an explanation isn't needed for why we can see a life-permitting universe, because that's the only kind of universe we can see. This is called the anthropic principle. It was coined by Brandon Carter in 1973, and the principle basically states that all large regions and times in the universe don't have to be statistically identical, that just because we can view a life-permitting universe from where we are, it doesn't mean that the whole universe is life-permitting. Well, sure, but this still misses the point. The question isn't, can we see a life-permitting universe, or is the majority of the universe non-life-permitting, or what parts of the universe would permit life, but rather, what's the best explanation for the life-permitting conditions of the universe? This is where we meet the most recent theory of chance, the multiverse. The multiverse, or many worlds theory, proposes that our universe is just one member in an unknown multitude of universes, preferably an infinite number. And we've already talked about the 2 types of infinities. If there is an infinite number of universes, well then it stands to reason that by chance alone, a life-permitting universe would appear sometime, somewhere in this world ensemble. However, this multiverse theory presents 2 problems. First, how do these universes come into being? The prevailing idea is that there is a universe generator that creates these universes, but that would imply fine-tuning, and that the generator would have to be designed to create universes. And second, many theorists are very skeptical of this theory, primarily because it isn't physics. It's metaphysics and speculative at best. If the multiverse did exist, we can't detect it, we can't observe it, we can't study it, and we can't even prove that it exists. So then, what about design? The biggest and probably most vocal opponent to this option is Richard Dawkins. In his book, The God Delusion, which I encourage you to read, Dawkins' primary reason for not believing in the Christian God is actually this.
But it seems to me to be manifestly obvious that that is a futile kind of explanation, because, as the quotation says, who designed the designer, you have explained precisely nothing, because instead of just saying, oh, well, the knobs were tuned to the right values anyway, you say, oh, there was a God who knew how to tune the knobs to the right values. And if you're going to postulate that...
However, Dawkins is not a philosopher or a logician. He's an evolutionary biologist, and a good one. But by asking the question, who designed the designer, he betrays his ignorance on the subject of logic. His question leads to an infinite regress, or a sequence of reasoning or justification that can never come to an end. When asking who designed the designer, Dawkins rightly asserts that you then have to ask who designed that designer, and who designed that designer, and so on infinitely. However, in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. As William Lane Craig reminds us, this is an elementary point concerning inference to the best explanation as practiced in the philosophy of science. If Dawkins applied this critique to his own work, nothing would ever really be explained, because all his explanations would have to have explanations, and those explanations would have to have explanations, and so on, infinitely. By not applying his own argument to his own reasoning, Dawkins commits the taxicab fallacy, which we discussed in a previous video. You should watch it. In the end, Dawkins' argument is absurd. Does this mean that the Christian is committing the fallacy of petitio principii? Well, not at all. A Christian isn't saying that there's design without proving that there's design. Of the three options, we believe design has more going for it as an explanation of the fine-tuning found in the universe. Well, then surely the Christian's committing the fallacy of ad ignorantium. Again, not at all. The Christian is not saying that just because we don't understand how the design of the universe came to be, that it must be God. Rather, given the available options, design makes more sense of the available data. Then is the Christian committing Hoyle's fallacy? Well, this is where a person assumes that a possible event of low probability can never happen and/or would never happen in real life. Again, not at all. Is it possible that we did just get really lucky? Well, sure, but it is so improbable that it is actually almost impossible. Again, design makes more sense, which leads us to the conclusion. Therefore, it is due to design. Here, Dawkins once again argues that because the universe is so unimaginably complex, the designer would be just as, or even more unimaginably complex. And since a life-permitting universe is so improbable, the potentially even more complex designer must be even more improbable. Well, that's not true. If the universe was designed, that means this designer designed space, time, matter, and energy. And the designer wouldn't be these things, which leaves the possibility of an abstract object. That is an object that has no causal power, like numbers, concepts, or a mind. As a pure mind without a body, God could be remarkably simple. And just because a mind may have complex ideas, well, that doesn't mean the mind itself is complex. And just because we don't know the explanation behind the mind, it doesn't mean that the mind is a bad explanation as to why the universe appears to be designed for life. So if the universe is fine-tuned for life by design, this logically leads to the next question. Who is the designer? And I'm sure you've guessed it by now, God. Now, we need to note that designer does not mean or imply creator. This is where you can begin to evangelize about the Christian God, who we believe is both designer and creator. Whew, we made it. Thanks for sticking through till the end. Soon you'll be ready to use this argument when talking about whether or not it's reasonable for God to exist with your non-believing friends after a little bit of practice and some possible repeat viewings of this video. Every time. I'm just gonna do it every time. Thanks for joining us today. Next time we'll look at the moral argument, where we will answer the question, can you be good without God? I'm Taylor Drake with Timothy Ministries. Happy reasoning and blessings.